Marcus hadn't planned on telling the doctor about the scratches. He'd worn long sleeves for a reason, had even rehearsed a deflection on the drive over. Just dry skin, nothing serious. But when Dr. Reyes asked him to roll them up for the routine blood pressure check, the words dissolved before he could use them. 3 lines ran along his left forearm, starting at the wrist and dragging upward toward the elbow. Deep, almost deliberate looking. "How long has this been happening?" Dr. Reyes asked. She traced a finger just above the marks without touching them, studying them the way Marcus imagined she might study a crack in the foundation of a building she was thinking about buying. "A few weeks," he said. "Maybe a month." She looked up. "And are you sleeping well?" He thought about the mornings, waking up with the throw blanket from the couch folded on the kitchen table when he always slept in the bedroom. A glass of water on the counter he had no memory of pouring. The front door unlocked when he was absolutely certain that he'd double-checked it before bed. The way his socks were sometimes damp in the morning, as if he'd been walking on the bathroom tile for a long time. "Not really, no." Dr. Reyes sat down and folded her hands in her lap with the calm, unhurried energy of someone who had heard stranger things before lunch. She told him that the scratches, combined with the disrupted sleep and the small domestic mysteries he'd described, pointed toward parasomnia, a category of sleep disorders that included sleepwalking. People who sleepwalked were often completely unaware of it. They could move through entire rooms, unlock doors, carry objects, and wake with no memory of any of it. The scratches were most likely self-inflicted during these episodes, she said. Nails against skin, the body moving without a mind to supervise it. Marcus listened. He was 34 years old, lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a quiet part of the city, and had never sleepwalked a day in his life, or at least had never known that he had. He agreed to the referral to a sleep specialist. He agreed to a follow-up in 3 weeks. And when Dr. Reyes suggested, almost as an afterthought, that he set up a camera in his bedroom to document the episodes, he nodded as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. It was only in the car, sitting at a red light with both hands on the wheel, that he let himself think about what it actually meant. That somewhere between closing his eyes and opening them again each night, he was getting up and doing things he would never remember. That there was a version of him, loose in his apartment in the dark, that he had never met. He bought a small camera from an electronics store the following afternoon. Nothing special. A wide-angle lens, night vision, motion activated. He set it on his dresser, angled toward the bed, and felt faintly ridiculous doing it, the way a person feels when they catch themselves double-locking a door against a threat they don't entirely believe in. The first 2 nights produced nothing interesting. The footage showed Marcus asleep, motionless, a rumpled shape under the duvet. He watched the recordings on fast-forward each morning with a cup of coffee in his hand and felt, if anything, mildly reassured. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it had already passed. The 3rd night was different. He saw himself sit up in bed at 2:17 a.m. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing of ordinary waking, but all at once, as if something had pulled him upright by a wire threaded through his sternum. He sat there for almost a full minute, facing the wall, perfectly still. Then he got up, walked to the bedroom door, and left. The camera's field of view didn't extend into the hallway, and for 11 minutes the frame held nothing but an empty, disheveled bed and the pale blue glow of the streetlight through the curtain. When he returned, he walked back to the bed and lay down with an exactness that didn't look like sleep. It looked like something returning to position. He watched his sleeping self on the screen and felt a clean, cold discomfort he couldn't quite name. He checked his arms that morning. 2 new scratches, faint but present, crossing the older ones at an angle. He told himself it was fine. He had the footage. He was documenting the episodes just as Dr. Reyes had suggested. He moved the camera to the hallway for a wider angle, ordered a motion-activated light for the kitchen, and went to work. He did not, yet, notice the thing in the corner of the bedroom. It took him until the fifth night's footage to see it, and only because he'd paused the recording to check the timestamp. It was in the far left of the frame, partially obscured by the shadow of the wardrobe. A shape that was too dark and too still to be furniture, but didn't move the way a person would move either. It stood at the edge of where the camera could see, and it did nothing. It simply watched him sleep. Marcus rewound the footage to the beginning of that night and watched from the start. The shape was there from the moment the recording began. 11:43 p.m., 12 minutes after he'd gone to bed. It hadn't arrived. It had simply always been there, at the edge of the frame, still as something that had never needed to move. He found her name through the building's management office after 3 days of trying. Eleanor Voss. She had lived in his apartment for 9 years. In October, 4 years before Marcus moved in, she had been found at the bottom of the back stairwell with a head injury that the official report described carefully as consistent with a fall. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The case had been reviewed twice and closed both times for insufficient evidence, which was, Marcus had come to understand, a polite way of saying, "We believe something happened here, and we cannot prove it." He sat with her name for a long time. He thought about the shape in the footage, standing in the corner of the room where she had once lived, watching him the way someone watches a person they are trying to decide whether to trust. He went back through all the footage. Night after night she was there, always at the edge of the frame, always still, always watching. But as the nights progressed, he began to notice something else. She wasn't looking at him. Not exactly. Her attention seemed directed somewhere slightly past him, toward the wall beside the door, as if there were something there that only she could see. And on the nights he woke with new scratches, the scratches weren't on his arms. They were on his hands, his knuckles, as if he'd been pressing his palms against something in the dark. He knocked on the wall beside the door one afternoon, working his way down from the ceiling, listening to the sound change. Hollow, hollow, hollow. And then, at about shoulder height, solid. Too solid. He got a screwdriver and removed the baseboard. Behind it was a strip of wall that had been replastered at some point after the original construction, newer than the plaster on either side. He cut into it carefully and found a small gap between the walls, barely 4 inches deep, in which Eleanor Voss had apparently left the only evidence she could. Photographs. A folded sheet of paper with dates and names written in a tight, controlled hand. A man's name, recurring. Dates that aligned with what Marcus now understood were her attempts to document something she was terrified to say aloud. He called the detective whose name appeared in the original case file. He sent everything digitally that same night. 2 weeks later, he received a message telling him the case had been reopened. That night, for the first time since he'd set up the camera, the corner of the bedroom was empty. He watched the footage the next morning and felt the apartment differently, the way a room feels after all the windows have been opened. The scratches didn't come back. He almost stopped checking the footage. He thought about calling Dr. Reyes to tell her he'd been sleeping better. He thought privately and with some embarrassment that maybe he'd done something good. Finally, it was over, he thought. It was 3 weeks later when he saw her again. He'd been reviewing the previous night's footage out of habit more than worry, half watching it on his laptop while eating breakfast. She appeared at 3:08 a.m., in the corner where she'd always stood, and for a moment his heart lifted. She came back. Maybe she just wanted him to know. And then he saw that something was wrong. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the wall. She was facing away from him entirely, turned toward the corner where the wall met the ceiling, toward something above and behind her that the camera couldn't see. Her posture was different. The stillness that had always felt patient, watchful, somehow deliberate, now felt like the stillness of something that had stopped moving because it didn't dare. She was afraid. Her right arm extended behind her, palm open, reaching in his direction without turning toward him. Not the gesture of someone wanting to be seen, the gesture of someone trying to warn without drawing attention to the warning. And then, between one frame and the next, she was gone. Marcus set down his coffee. The scratches that morning were on his shoulders, both of them. 4 lines each, pressing down from above. He didn't sleep the next night. He sat in the kitchen with every light on and his laptop open and tried to find an explanation that would hold. Eleanor had come back. A residual echo, maybe. Grief didn't follow a schedule, but her posture stayed in his mind. The turned back, the outstretched hand, the fear. And no version of residual echo explained why a ghost would be afraid. He found the first mention 3 hours into his search, in a digitized archive of a local history journal from the 1970s. A brief paragraph, wedged between an article about the city's old rail lines and a piece about a former mayor, describing a series of unexplained events reported by residents of a boarding house that had once occupied the block where his building now stood. Scratches on the skin, objects moved in the night. In every case, residents reported the same sensation upon waking, that something had been very close while they slept, close enough to breathe on them, close enough to touch. In every case, the events had been preceded by a brief period in which residents reported seeing a figure that was later determined to be the ghost of a previous occupant. He read the line again. Preceded by a brief period in which residents reported seeing a figure. Not accompanied by, not simultaneous with, preceded. The ghost always came first. He found 2 more records over the next hour. A journal entry from the 1940s, a single page torn from what appeared to be a longer account, dated 1921, in which the writer, methodical, detached, clinical in the way of someone trying not to panic, described the same sequence of events with precise consistency. The apparition of a known deceased individual, a period of apparent resolution, and then the other thing, which the 1921 writer described only as the prior presence and refused to elaborate on further, except to note that it did not haunt individuals, it haunted locations. It had been in the location for a very long time. The deceased, he theorized, had not appeared to communicate with the living. The deceased had appeared because something else had moved them into position to do so, had used their unfinished grief as a door. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen, which was the floor of the apartment above him, and thought about Eleanor Voss standing in his bedroom corner for weeks, and whether she had chosen to be there. He thought about the way she had reached toward him in that last footage. Not look at me, not help me, run. He thought about the scratches on his shoulders, pressing down from above. He didn't run. He stayed, the way people stay when they have finally understood something, and the understanding has cost them the ability to move. He stayed, and he watched the camera feed on his laptop in real time. The bedroom visible and still and empty, the corner by the door dark and unoccupied. At 3:08 a.m. exactly, the camera turned itself off. The new tenant moved in on a Thursday in late spring. Young woman, early 30s, recently relocated for work. She had a pleasant face and a sensible amount of furniture, and she tipped the movers well. The building manager showed her around the apartment, and she said she loved the light in the mornings, the way it came through the bedroom window and fell across the floor in long, clean angles. She slept well the first 2 nights, deeply, without dreams, the untroubled sleep of someone who has been carrying boxes and is finally, gratefully, still. On the third morning, she found a bruise on her forearm she didn't remember getting. Small, oblong. She pressed it with her thumb, and it ached in that particular way bruises ache when they are still new, still being decided. She told herself she'd bumped into something during the move. There was always something during a move. But on the fourth morning, there were two of them. And on the fifth, 3 thin lines along the back of her right hand, shallow but distinct, that she could not explain no matter how carefully she reconstructed her previous day. She mentioned it to a friend over the phone that evening, laughing a little at herself as she described it. The bruises, the scratches, the strange tiredness she couldn't seem to sleep off no matter how many hours she put in. Her friend suggested maybe she was moving around in her sleep. Maybe she was sleepwalking. She should see a doctor, her friend said, or at the very least, set up a camera. In the corner of the bedroom, where the wardrobe cast its shadow against the wall, something that had been waiting for a very long time settled into position. On the dresser, left behind by the previous tenant, a small, wide-angle camera pointed toward the bed.